My mother looked horrified when I stepped out of the car wearing my military dress blues. Not proud. Not emotional. Horrified. She rushed toward me before I even reached the church doors and whispered through clenched teeth, "Please go home and change." I actually thought she was joking. Then my father grabbed my arm and said something I'll never forget. "Today is about your brother. Don't embarrass this family with the military thing." The military thing. 3 combat deployments. A Silver Star. 8 years of service. Reduced to the military thing. But 30 minutes later, inside that wedding reception, 12 veterans stood up simultaneously, and my entire family froze. I hadn't been back to Cedar Hill in almost 11 months when my mother texted me the church address for my brother's wedding. "No, can't wait to see you. No, we missed you. Just St. Matthew's Chapel. Ceremony starts at 2 o'clock. Please arrive quietly." Quietly. I stared at that word while sitting inside the airport terminal, still wearing combat boots from deployment travel. Around me, families hugged returning soldiers. Kids waved tiny flags. An older man thanked me for my service while passing my gate. Meanwhile, my own family wanted me to arrive quietly. My younger brother Ethan was getting married to a corporate lawyer named Olivia. The wedding was apparently enormous. Country club reception. String quartet. Nearly 150 guests. My mother had spent 6 months posting nonstop about it online. Every tasting. Every floral arrangement. Every tuxedo fitting. Ethan smiling beside our parents in every photo like the son they always wanted the world to see. There was never a single mention of me coming home from overseas. That part wasn't surprising. My parents had learned to treat my military career like an embarrassing relative nobody discussed at dinner parties. Especially after the Silver Star ceremony last year. I still remembered standing in dress blues while cameras flashed around me. My commanding officer called me courageous. The governor shook my hand. 3 hours later, my mother texted, "Please don't post too many military pictures online. People get uncomfortable with war stuff." I folded that memory away like I always did. By the time I reached my hotel near the chapel, rain was falling lightly across Cedar Hill. I carried my garment bag carefully into the room and hung it beside the closet. Then I unzipped it. Dark blue marine dress uniform. Pressed perfectly. Silver Star medal secured above the pocket. I stood there staring at it silently, because deep down, I already knew my parents were going to hate that I wore it. My parents used to tell people I was going through a phase. That's how they described the United States Marine Corps. Not service. Not sacrifice. Not commitment. A phase. When I enlisted at 19, my mother cried for 3 straight days like I'd announced a prison sentence instead of military service. My father barely spoke to me the entire week before basic training. Meanwhile, Ethan had just been accepted into Northwestern Law, and suddenly every family conversation revolved around him. "Your brother has such a bright future," my mother would say proudly. Then she'd look at me wearing recruit sweats and ask, "Are you absolutely sure you want this life?" What she really meant was, "Why can't you be normal like your brother?" At first I kept trying to earn their approval anyway. I mailed postcards during training, called whenever I could, sent photos from promotion ceremonies. My father responded with short messages like, "Stay safe. Your mother worries." Ethan, meanwhile, got celebration dinners every semester. When I came home after my first overseas deployment, nobody even came to the airport. I took a taxi home carrying 2 duffel bags and a fractured shoulder I hadn't fully disclosed to anyone. My mother opened the front door, and the first thing she said was, "You look so thin." Not, "We missed you." Not, "We're proud of you." Just thin. The worst moment came last year after the Silver Star ceremony. I almost didn't invite them. But some stupid part of me still hoped maybe this would finally change things. Maybe seeing me honored would make them understand. Instead, during the reception afterward, my mother spent 20 minutes talking to another guest about Ethan's new condo downtown. A reporter approached our table asking for a family photo. My father actually sighed before standing up. Later that night, my mother texted me, "We support you, but maybe stop posting military things publicly. Some people find uniforms intimidating." Intimidating. I remember staring at that message in my hotel room thinking something I'd never admitted before. My parents weren't ashamed I joined the military. They were ashamed of me. The wedding invitation arrived 3 months after my deployment ended. Heavy cream-colored paper, gold lettering, expensive enough to feel more like a corporate gala than a family wedding. Ethan Carter and Olivia Bennett request the honor of your presence. Honor. I almost laughed reading that word. Inside the envelope was a detailed itinerary that looked professionally designed. Welcome dinner, church ceremony, cocktail hour, reception seating assignments. I noticed the first strange thing immediately. Family photographs were scheduled for 11 in the morning. My invitation instructed me to arrive at 1:30. 2 hours later. At first I assumed it was a mistake until my mother called that night. Sweetheart, we already finished most family portraits earlier in the day for timing reasons. Timing reasons. Of course. Then came the second detail. No +1. I'd dated Daniel for nearly a year, and my parents knew that. Ethan had met him twice. Olivia followed him on Instagram. Still, his name wasn't included anywhere. When I asked my mother about it, she hesitated before saying, "We're trying to keep things intimate." Intimate. 150 guests. Ice sculptures. Live jazz band. But apparently one extra chair was too much. A week later, Ethan forwarded me the reception seating chart. Table 14. Near the kitchen doors. Not with family. Not even near the bridal party. I stared at the chart longer than I should have. Every detail felt carefully designed to keep me present, but invisible. Then, 2 nights before the wedding, I called Olivia to confirm arrival times. She sounded nervous immediately. "Your mom's just dressed," she said quickly. "She really wants everything simple and elegant." Simple. There was that word again. As we talked, I heard muffled voices in the background. Then my mother's voice suddenly cut through the phone clearly enough for me to hear. "I just don't want her showing up in that uniform and making the whole wedding about herself." Silence hit my chest like a punch. Olivia stopped speaking. So did I. Because at that exact moment, everything finally made sense. Rain covered the church parking lot in a thin gray mist when I pulled in beside the entrance. For a moment, I just sat there with both hands gripping the steering wheel. Guests in expensive suits hurried inside, holding umbrellas while soft violin music drifted from the chapel doors. I could still leave. That thought stayed in my head longer than it should have. Then I looked at myself in the mirror. Marine dress blues. Silver star medal. Hair pulled tightly back. The uniform looked sharp, formal, earned. Not attention-seeking. Earned. I stepped out of the car. Almost immediately, conversations nearby slowed. A valet straightened slightly when he noticed the medal. An older woman near the entrance touched her husband's arm and whispered something while looking at me. Then the church doors burst open. My mother hurried toward me so fast her heels nearly slipped on the pavement. Her face wasn't angry yet. It was panicked. "Oh my God," she whispered. "You actually wore it." I shut the car door calmly. "Yes, Mom. Please tell me you brought another outfit." Before I could answer, she grabbed my wrist gently and lowered her voice. "Sweetheart, people are already staring." I looked around. People were staring, but not in disgust. Mostly curiosity, respect, recognition. "I'm not changing," I said quietly. Her expression tightened instantly. "You don't understand how this looks." "How it looks? This." She motioned toward my uniform like it physically embarrassed her. "The medal's the military thing. Ethan's wedding is supposed to feel elegant." Military thing. There it was again. A black SUV pulled beside the curb, and my father stepped out adjusting his tie. The second he saw me, his entire expression darkened. "You wore the uniform anyway?" "Yes." He walked closer, lowering his voice sharply. "For once, can you not make everything about yourself?" The words landed harder than I expected. "I'm attending my brother's wedding," I replied carefully. "Not a nightclub." Dad glanced toward the church entrance, where guests continued noticing me. "People came here to celebrate Ethan," he said coldly. "Not hear war stories." War stories. As if that was all my service meant. Then my mother leaned closer and whispered the sentence that nearly made me turn around and leave completely. "You're going to ruin this wedding before it even starts." I should have walked away right then. Every instinct in my body told me to get back in the car, drive to the airport, and forget the entire wedding ever happened. Instead, I stood there in the rain while my parents looked at me like I was carrying something shameful instead of wearing the uniform I'd spent 8 years earning. My father checked the church entrance nervously before turning back toward me. "Listen carefully," he said quietly. "People here are executives, attorneys, judges. This isn't some military banquet." I actually blinked at him. "A military banquet? You know what I mean." "No," I replied. "I really don't." My mother stepped in quickly before the conversation escalated. "Sweetheart, nobody's insulting your service. We're just asking you not to make a statement today." "A statement? The uniform draws attention," she snapped softly. "And Ethan deserves one day where everything isn't overshadowed." Overshadowed. That word burned worse than anything else. Because deep down, I realized this had never been about the wedding. It was about visibility. My parents had spent years building Ethan into the success story they proudly showed the world. Corporate lawyer. Country club wedding. Perfect life. And standing beside all of that, I reminded people of something uncomfortable. Sacrifice. War. Duty. Loss. Things that couldn't be polished into elegant dinner conversation. "You really think I wore this for attention?" I asked quietly. Neither of them answered. That hurt more than if they had. My father exhaled impatiently. "Can you please just think about your brother for once?" I stared at him in disbelief. For once. As if my entire life hadn't already revolved around making everyone else comfortable. The rain started falling harder around us. Guests passed nearby, pretending not to listen while absolutely listening. Then, near the church doors, I noticed an elderly man standing alone beneath the awning. Dark suit, silver hair, military posture. His eyes were fixed directly on my medals. Not mockingly, respectfully. When our eyes met, he gave me a small, silent nod. Nothing dramatic, just recognition. But somehow that tiny gesture steadied something inside me my family had been trying to break for years. Without another word, I turned toward the church entrance and started walking. The church doors felt heavier than they should have. Each step toward them sounded sharp beneath my polished shoes while rain tapped softly against the stone walkway behind me. I kept hearing my mother's voice repeating in my head, "You're going to ruin this wedding." For a few seconds, doubt crept in anyway. Maybe I should have worn a normal dress. Maybe this really was selfish. Maybe my family was right. Then my fingers brushed the silver star medal pinned above my pocket. And suddenly, I wasn't standing outside a church anymore. I was back in northern Syria 2 years earlier. Smoke. Collapsed concrete. Radio static screaming through the dark. Our convoy had been hit outside a civilian evacuation route. Chaos erupted instantly. One of our vehicles caught fire while incoming rounds tore through the street around us. I remembered hearing Corporal Mendez yelling for help. I remembered the little girl crying somewhere behind the wreckage. Mostly I remembered fear. Not movie-style courage. Real fear. The kind that turns your legs numb while you move anyway because someone else needs you to. That night changed everything. 3 Marines made it home because we stayed behind long enough to pull them out. 2 civilians survived because we refused to leave them trapped. And Corporal Mendez, before being evacuated, bleeding heavily onto the transport floor, grabbed my vest and said something I still carry with me. "Promise me you'll never apologize for wearing that uniform." I hadn't thought about those words in months. Not until now. Standing outside my brother's wedding while my own parents treated the uniform like an embarrassment. The truth was I never wore dress blues for attention. Nobody who serves honestly does. You wear them for the people who didn't come home. For the sacrifices nobody sees. For the years that changed you permanently. You wear them because the uniform becomes part of your identity long after deployment ends. I stopped walking briefly near the chapel entrance and took one slow breath. Then I straightened my shoulders. Because no matter how uncomfortable it made my family, I was done apologizing for who I was. The moment I stepped inside St. Matthew's Chapel, the whisper started. Not loud, just soft shifts in the room like wind moving through trees. The ceremony hadn't started yet. Guests filled the wooden pews beneath glowing chandeliers, while violin music floated quietly through the church. Conversations blended together until the sound of my shoes against marble interrupted them. Then heads turned, one after another. I felt every pair of eyes notice the uniform before they noticed me. A little boy near the aisle stopped fidgeting and stared openly at the medals on my chest. His mother gently lowered his hand after he pointed. Two older men near the front exchanged quick glances the second they saw the silver star ribbon. Near the altar, Ethan looked up briefly from talking with his groomsmen. His smile disappeared immediately. Not angry, more confused, like he suddenly realized the situation was bigger than our parents had described. I spotted my mother near the front pew gripping her purse tightly while whispering something sharply to my father. Dad didn't even look at me. I walked slowly toward the back rows exactly where my seating assignment placed me. Table 14 energy. Invisible family member energy. A few guests shifted awkwardly as I passed, but not because they seemed uncomfortable. Honestly, most looked respectful. Curious. One elderly woman touched my sleeve softly as I moved past her pew. Thank you for your service, she whispered kindly. I smiled politely. Thank you, ma'am. Then I reached the final back row and sat alone. From there, I could see the entire chapel. White roses, tall candles, perfect wedding decorations. And, directly ahead of me, my family pretending I barely existed. The ceremony music swelled louder as guests settled into silence. Then something unexpected happened. Across the aisle, 3 older men seated together kept looking toward me repeatedly. Not casually, carefully. One of them leaned forward slightly, narrowing his eyes toward my chest ribbons. Another whispered something into the third man's ear. Finally, the oldest of them slowly nodded to himself. I saw recognition cross his face instantly. Not recognition of me. Recognition of what that medal meant. Then, just before the ceremony officially began, I heard him murmur quietly. That's not just a dress uniform. By the time the ceremony ended, my parents looked exhausted. Not emotional. Stressed. Like they'd spent the entire service waiting for something terrible to happen simply because I existed in the room wearing dress blues. The guests slowly poured into the reception hall beside the country club ballroom while soft jazz played through hidden speakers. Crystal chandeliers reflected across polished floors, and servers carried silver trays filled with champagne glasses. Everything looked expensive, carefully curated, and completely disconnected from me. I found table 14 exactly where I expected it to be, near the kitchen entrance, close enough to hear dishes clattering behind the swinging doors. I almost laughed when I saw it. Some things were so obvious they became funny. I sat down quietly, fully prepared to spend the evening ignored. Instead, within 10 minutes, people started approaching my table. First, it was an older woman from the chapel. My husband served in Vietnam, she explained warmly. He noticed your medal immediately. A few minutes later, a younger couple stopped to thank me for my service because their daughter was currently in the Navy. Then a man in his 60s asked what branch I served in before shaking my hand firmly and saying, Semper Fi. Every interaction stayed respectful, brief, natural. But across the ballroom, I could feel my mother watching every single one. Like each conversation confirmed her worst fear. Not that I was embarrassing the family. That people respected me. Ethan noticed it too. I saw him glance toward my table repeatedly while speaking with guests near the dance floor. Confusion slowly replaced irritation on his face. Why does everyone keep going over there? That question was practically written across his expression. Then the elderly man from the church finally approached my table. Up close, he carried himself with unmistakable military posture despite his age. Mind if I sit for a moment? He asked politely. Of course not, sir. He lowered himself carefully into the chair across from me and studied the silver star ribbon again. Then his eyes lifted toward mine. Permission to ask, he said quietly. Where you earned that silver star, Marine? Fallujah? The older man asked quietly after I answered his question. I nodded once. For a moment, he didn't speak. He just leaned back slowly in his chair, studying me with the kind of expression only veterans seem to understand. Not pity, not fascination, recognition. "My name's Walter Hayes," he finally said, extending his hand. "Retired Marine Corps Colonel." His grip was firm despite the deep wrinkles across his hands. "Captain Ava Carter," I replied automatically. A faint smile crossed his face. "You still say it like you're active duty." "Habit, sir." Walter glanced again toward the Silver Star ribbon. "You mind telling me what happened?" I hesitated. Not because I was ashamed. Because military stories never sound the way civilians expect them to. There's no dramatic soundtrack. No heroic speeches. Mostly fear. Noise. And decisions you pray were right afterward. Still, something about him felt safe. So I told him. Not every detail. Just enough. The convoy attack. The civilians trapped near the collapsed building. Corporal Mendez pinned behind burning debris. The evacuation route taking incoming fire while everyone screamed over comms. Walter listened without interrupting once. When I mentioned staying behind to help extract the wounded Marines, his jaw tightened slightly. "And you went back into the street twice?" he asked carefully. I shrugged. There were still people there. For several seconds, he stared down at the table silently. Then he asked the question I wasn't prepared for. "Your family knows what you did?" I looked across the ballroom instinctively. My mother was smiling stiffly beside Ethan while pretending not to watch us. My father avoided looking in my direction entirely. I turned back toward Walter. "They prefer not to talk about my service much," I admitted quietly. Something changed in his expression immediately. Not anger exactly. Disappointment. The kind that comes from understanding something painful without needing it explained. Walter slowly pushed his chair back and stood. Across the ballroom, a few older guests noticed him rising. "You know," he said calmly, adjusting his jacket, "I've attended hundreds of ceremonies in my life." His eyes moved toward the crowded reception hall. "But I've never liked watching heroes sit alone." Colonel Hayes didn't sit back down. Instead, he picked up his water glass and turned slowly toward the center of the ballroom. At first, nobody noticed. The jazz music still played softly near the dance floor, while servers carried trays between tables. Guests continued talking over dessert and champagne. Then Walter raised his voice, not shouting, but carrying the kind of command that instantly cuts through noise. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said clearly, "may I have your attention for just a moment?" Conversations stopped one by one. Forks lowered. Heads turned. Even the band went quiet. Across the room, I saw my mother's face immediately tense. Walter stood tall beside table 14, one hand resting lightly against the chair in front of him. "I apologize for interrupting the reception," he continued calmly. "But after speaking with Captain Ava Carter tonight, I realized something important." Now the entire ballroom was listening. Ethan looked confused beside Olivia near the sweetheart table. My father had gone completely rigid. Walter looked directly toward me. "We have a Silver Star recipient sitting quietly in the back of this room." The silence afterward felt enormous. A few guests exchanged surprised glances. Others turned fully toward me for the first time all evening. My chest tightened instantly. Walter continued before anyone could react. "For those unfamiliar," he said respectfully, "the Silver Star is awarded for extraordinary valor in combat. Very few service members ever receive one." The ballroom remained completely silent. No clinking glasses. No whispers. Just attention. "She earned that medal while rescuing wounded Marines and civilians during an active attack overseas," Walter said. "And apparently, she intended to sit back here near the kitchen all evening without mentioning it once." A few people looked toward table 14, then back, toward me again. I saw realization spreading across faces throughout the room. Not because of the medal itself. Because they finally understood I hadn't worn the uniform for attention. I'd worn it because I earned it. Walter slowly lifted his glass higher. "I spent 32 years in the Marine Corps," he said. "And I can tell you this honestly." His voice softened slightly. "Courage like that deserves recognition." For one heartbeat, nobody moved. Then somewhere near the dance floor, a woman started clapping softly. Another joined her. Then another. The applause spread across the ballroom in slow waves until nearly every guest was clapping. Not loud and chaotic. Respectful. Sincere. And across the room, my parents looked absolutely horrified. The applause should have been the end of it. Instead, it became the beginning. Because halfway through the clapping, one man near the center table slowly stood to his feet. He looked to be in his 70s. Navy veteran, judging by the small pin on his lapel. He faced me directly and placed one trembling hand over his heart. The room quieted slightly again. Then another man stood beside him. Air Force. Then a third. Army. One by one, scattered across the ballroom. Older men began rising from their chairs in complete silence. No speeches. No attention-seeking. Just respect. I counted them automatically, without meaning to. 4, 6, 9, 12. 12 veterans standing across the reception hall facing table 14. The jazz band had completely stopped playing now. Nobody moved. One veteran near the back gave a slow salute. Another simply nodded while wiping discreetly at his eyes. And suddenly the entire atmosphere of the wedding changed. Not dramatic. Not political. Emotional. Heavy in the quietest possible way. Because everyone in that ballroom understood they were witnessing something real. Something honest. I felt my throat tighten painfully. For years, I'd trained myself not to react emotionally in public. The military teaches you control early. You learn how to compartmentalize fear, grief, exhaustion. But standing there while 12 veterans honored me in complete silence, that control nearly broke. Across the ballroom, Ethan stared at me like he was seeing me clearly for the first time in his life. Not as the difficult sister. Not as the embarrassing military daughter. As someone who had carried things he never bothered to understand. Beside him, Olivia looked openly emotional. My mother, meanwhile, seemed frozen in place. Her eyes moved nervously around the ballroom as if trying to figure out how the situation had slipped beyond her control. Because this wasn't supposed to happen. I was supposed to sit quietly in the background. Eat dinner unnoticed. Leave early. Instead, an entire room now saw me differently than my parents had described me for years. Colonel Hayes finally lowered his glass and looked toward the standing veterans around the ballroom. Then he spoke softly. "Brothers," he said, "thank you." One of the veterans answered from across the room. "No," the older man replied while looking directly at me. "Thank her." And for the first time that entire night, my father finally looked ashamed. The rest of the reception never fully recovered its original atmosphere. Not because the wedding was ruined, because the truth had entered the room. And once people saw it, they couldn't unsee it. Guests who had barely acknowledged me earlier now stopped by table 14 constantly. Some thanked me quietly. Others simply smiled respectfully before moving on. One elderly woman squeezed my hand and whispered, "My grandson's deployed right now. Seeing you tonight means more than you know." Meanwhile, my parents looked trapped inside their own carefully constructed image. My mother suddenly became overly cheerful. Too cheerful. The kind of smile people wear when they know everyone around them is judging something they can't control anymore. "Oh, Ava's always been very dedicated," she told one couple loudly as they passed nearby. "We're extremely proud of her service." I nearly laughed hearing it. Proud. That word had appeared publicly for the first time in 8 years. My father tried handling things differently. He stayed quiet, avoided conversations, avoided eye contact, avoided me completely. But the problem for both of them was simple now. The room had already seen the truth. Not through accusations. Not through drama. Through contrast. 12 veterans had stood for me without hesitation while my own parents spent the entire evening trying to hide me. And people noticed that. I saw it in the uncomfortable glances guests kept giving my parents afterward. Even Ethan's college friends started approaching me more warmly than they approached him. At one point, Olivia crossed the ballroom unexpectedly and sat beside me for a minute while the band restarted softly in the background. "I'm really glad you came," she said quietly. There was genuine emotion in her voice. Not politeness. Real sincerity. Thank you, I replied carefully. She hesitated before speaking again. For what it's worth, she glanced briefly toward my parents across the room. I don't think they understand what they almost made you hide tonight. Neither did I. Not fully. Not until now. Across the ballroom, my father finally looked toward me again. Only this time, he couldn't hold my gaze for more than a second before looking away. I was standing near the balcony outside the ballroom when Ethan finally found me. The reception music sounded distant out there, softened by rain and cold evening air drifting across the country club terrace. For a few seconds, neither of us spoke. My younger brother adjusted his tie awkwardly before leaning against the railing beside me. You could have told me, he said quietly. I looked at him carefully. Told you what? All of it. I almost laughed at that. But not cruelly. Just tired. You never asked. That answer hit him harder than I expected. Ethan looked down toward the parking lot below us, while guests laughed faintly somewhere inside behind the glass doors. I didn't know, he admitted after a long silence. Mom and Dad always made it sound like you pushed everyone away. There it was. Finally. The narrative I'd lived with for years. Difficult daughter. Cold sister. Attention-seeking Marine. I folded my arms against the cold. I stopped trying after a while. Ethan frowned slightly. What does that mean? It means every time I came home, I felt like a problem everyone tolerated instead of family. His expression shifted immediately. Not defensive anymore. Guilty. I continued quietly before I lost the nerve. When I got deployed, Mom barely called. When I received the Silver Star, Dad changed the subject halfway through dinner to talk about your promotion. Ethan stared at me silently. I honestly thought you knew, I said. No, he answered quickly. I swear I didn't. And for the first time all night, I believed him. The rain tapped softly against the balcony railing between us. Finally, Ethan rubbed both hands over his face and exhaled slowly. Jesus, he muttered. I spent years believing you just didn't care about this family. I looked toward the ballroom where our parents stood laughing too loudly beside guests. I cared, I said quietly. Eventually, I just got tired of begging people to care back. Ethan swallowed hard. Then he looked at me with an expression I'd never seen from my brother before. Regret. I should have asked more questions, he said softly. About 20 minutes later, Ethan tapped his champagne glass for attention. The ballroom slowly quieted. Guests turned toward the sweetheart table expecting the usual wedding speech. Olivia smiled beside him while the band lowered their instruments. Ethan looked nervous. More nervous than he had during the ceremony. My wife told me to keep this short, he began, earning light laughter from the crowd. Then his expression changed. But there's something I need to say first. I felt my stomach tighten instantly. Across the room, my mother straightened in her chair. Ethan glanced toward me. Not past me. At me. When people talk about success, he said slowly, they usually mean careers, money, titles, things like that. Several guests nodded politely. I spent most of my life trying to become successful, he continued. And, honestly, I thought I understood what sacrifice looked like. His voice caught slightly. But tonight, I realized my sister's been carrying sacrifices most of us can't even imagine. The ballroom went completely silent. My mother's smile disappeared instantly. Ethan kept going anyway. For years, Ava showed up for this family, whether we deserved it or not. Deployments. Holidays missed. Things she probably can't even talk about. He paused briefly. And somehow we made her feel like those sacrifices were something to hide. Nobody moved. Nobody even touched their drinks. I saw my father lower his eyes toward the tablecloth. Ethan looked directly at me again. I'm ashamed it took tonight for me to understand how badly we failed you. Emotion rose into my throat so fast it almost hurt. Beside him, Olivia reached for his hand supportively. Then Ethan lifted his glass toward me. My sister spent years becoming something far more important than successful, he said quietly. His voice steadied. She became brave. The silence afterward lasted barely a second before applause exploded across the ballroom again. Louder this time. Not polite applause. Emotional applause. Several guests stood immediately. Then more followed. I saw Colonel Hayes clapping proudly near the dance floor while some of the veterans nodded toward me again. And, across the entire reception hall, my parents sat frozen in absolute silence. 3 months after Ethan's wedding, I met him for breakfast near the lakefront in Chicago. Just the two of us. No parents. No forced politeness. No pretending. We talked for almost 3 hours. About deployment. About childhood. About all the years we somehow lived in the same family while understanding completely different versions of each other. For the first time in a long time, talking to my brother actually felt easy. Things with my parents stayed complicated. My mother started texting more often after the wedding, usually short messages asking how I was doing. My father still struggled with direct conversations, but something in him had changed that night. Not completely, but enough. Enough to finally stop looking embarrassed whenever someone mentioned my service. I didn't expect miracles after one wedding reception. Some damage takes years to build. It doesn't disappear overnight. But strangely enough, I stopped needing their approval after that evening anyway. That was the real change. A month later, I attended a military awards banquet downtown. This time, when I put on my dress blues, I didn't hesitate in front of the mirror wondering who might feel uncomfortable seeing them. I just wore them. Afterward, back home in my apartment, I carefully hung the uniform inside my closet and paused for a moment before closing the door. The Silver Star ribbon caught the light briefly beneath the hanger. For years, my family treated that uniform like something shameful. But 12 strangers at a wedding reminded me of something I should have remembered long ago. Honor only feels heavy when you spend too much time carrying other people's shame with it.